Today's headline is Story of a Noted Fight, How the United States and the Macedonian Met. The subheadline says, Display of courage shown on both sides that was remarkable. Pen picture of the terrible havoc on board the British vessel. It says, the fight between the United States frigate United States and the British frigate Macedonian is looked upon in the American Navy as one of the greatest gunnery feats in the history of the service. The engagement took place October 25, 1812, and though an affair of many years past, the records on the American side are well preserved at the Navy Department, says the New York Times. They are, in fact, much fuller than in the case of most reports, Decatur taking the pains to hand down for future use all the benefits of the experience he gained that day. From the British side of the fight, the records are more or less incomplete, though much that was valuable has been learned in later years through the private letters written by the British captains subsequent to the affray. Recently, the Messrs. Notors had on exhibition in their gallery, mention of which has been made in these columns, Davidson's battle piece representing the engagement at the moment just previous to the hauling down of the Macedonian's flag. It was the climax of the fight, for it was then that 112 British men-of-war's men lay dead, dying, or wounded on the Macedonian's deck. The fight between the United States and the Macedonian occurred at a point some 200 miles to the southward and westward of the Azores Islands. The Macedonian captain John Carden, Royal Navy commanding, was on an outward-bound cruise to the West Indies. His ship was a brand-new frigate, fresh from Portsmouth dockyard. This yard the Macedonian had left not more than 2 weeks previously. On the morning of October 25th, the British frigate had about 300 men aboard. Her battery consisted of 38 carronades with a pivot gun on the forecastle and a small boat gun on the quarterdeck. Because of this, she earned the title given her in America of being a 40-gun ship. The crew of the Macedonian were for the most part trained men-of-war's men. There were some 20 impressed men aboard who had never seen service on a warship, but aside from this number, all hands had done duty 3 years or more. Under the British flag. Captain Carden always had the greatest admiration for the Macedonian's crew, and it was this very reliance on the personnel under him that caused that maneuver in the fight which lost him his ship. Good men as the bluejackets of the Macedonian were, they were still somewhat green and working together when they met the United States. The Macedonian had been hurried off from the Portsmouth yard, and now, not more than a couple of weeks out, without any opportunity for target practice and with only the training that came from the daily exercise at quarters, the Macedonian's men went into the fight without a murmur against the seasoned, well-shaken-down crew commanded by Decatur. The morning of October 25, 1812 was logged aboard the Macedonian as opening up clear and cool with a heavy swell running, the frigate standing along under topsails, topgallant sails, and courses. It was proposed to give the day to the men in the enjoyment of whatever sports they chose, and to make time fly all the more merrily, Captain Carden instructed the executive officer to see to a little extra allowance of grog being issued. At 8:45 o'clock in the morning, Captain Carden was seated in the cabin engaged in reading when he distinctly heard the call of the lookout at the foretop masthead call out, "Sail ho!" Without waiting to hear the counter-hail of the officer of the deck, Captain Carden sprang up his cabin companionway and himself hailed the lookout. "Can you make her out?" "Can't make her out, sir," was the reply. Captain Carden took 2 or 3 turns along the deck and a minute later sang out, "Masthead there." "Sir," came the reply. "Can you make out that sail?" "She is a square-rigged vessel, sir." "Here," said Captain Carden to the officer beside him. "Send a lookout to each masthead and an officer to the top, and keep a close eye on that fellow." And then a minute later came the cry from the main masthead. "The stranger's a frigate, sir, and bearing down this way." "Can you make out his rig?" "He looks like a Yankee, sir." The last hail was sufficient. Captain Carden was now surrounded by his executive and navigator and by 2 or more of the older officers, while on the lee side of the deck a knot of junior officers were assembled, all of them having tumbled up from below on hearing the captain's voice. Turning to his executive, Captain Carden said very quietly, "Clear ship for action, sir, and get the people to the guns." In an instant, the boatswains' pipes were ringing out their calls, and 300 bluejackets were knocking down bulkheads, reeving off preventer braces, swiftening down rigging, securing boats, rigging boarding nettings, unshipping ladders, piling hammocks here and there as breastworks, and all the details which enter into preparing a ship for battle. The Macedonians' men, though for the most part strange to one another, were too old to man-of-war duty not to work at such time quickly. The Macedonian was ready for the fight in 3 minutes. Her people went to the guns to the long roll of the drums. The frigate was now under foresail, fore, main, and mizzen-top sails, main clew garnets hauled up, royal yards in the rigging, and top-gallant sails furled. Her jib, foretop-gallant staysail, and spanker were set. The strange frigate was now distant about 2,000 yards and flying American colors. Captain Carr thought he recognized the United States, but was not sure. Both vessels were gradually closing, with both wary. On the Macedonian, the captain and executive officer had just made a twirl on the decks with pleasant words right and left to the men. It is known that the British captain felt at this moment the lack of training and target work which his hurried and early forced departure from Portsmouth had brought about, but he nevertheless felt a certain reliance in the training the majority of the men had had before coming aboard. At a distance of 1,500 yards from the American, the officer in charge of the pivot gun forward received permission to open up with a shot or two. The night was short, and Captain Carr ordered the firing ceased. The Macedonian now edged in a little closer and opened up with 3 guns to the port battery. The fire was short. Again Carr edged in, the United States also closing in. When at a distance of 1,000 yards, the American opened fire from his gun deck battery. His fire was directed at the sails, and the sound of his shots was not unlike the swish rip of canvas rending. The Macedonian was now firing from every gun that could be brought to bear, but without apparent effect. Carr ordered the firing ceased and the vessel run closer in. At 500 yards, he again opened with every gun. 10 minutes later, the mizzen-top mast went by the board. The enemy's fire now appeared to be directed at the mainmast, for a slaughter among the Marines drawn up in the waist was beginning to be something frightful. Carr ordered the Marines shifted forward and then dispersed as sharpshooters. The maintop mast now went by the board, and wreck clears were called away. The fighting at this point was something terrible. The American fire from being directed at the mainmast was now playing along the gun deck. Its effect was not unlike the crash and booming of a thunderstorm. The whole heaven was obscured by smoke, and from the American ship the constant stream of fire made that vessel look as if on fire. On the gun deck of the Macedonian, the slaughter was awful. One shot had killed outright and wounded 7 men. A sponger in handling his rammer to his opposite was cut in 2. 2 powder monkeys rushing to the ammunition hatch together were bodily lifted by a shot, and their mangled and lifeless bodies dashed against the carlines overhead. One bluejacket stooped over a group of 7 dead men in his search for a mate, and after turning each body, found the object of his hunt at the bottom of the heap. He gave one cry of, "Oh Tom," when his division officer ordered him back to his gun with the shout to avenge his mate's death. On the main deck, some 30 Marines lay dead or writhing in their wounds about the mainmast, while down in the cockpit the wounded lay in heaps about the door, their yells and cries reaching clear to the quarterdeck despite the terrible roar of the guns. Throughout it all, the British captain stood his post on the quarterdeck giving orders. He felt that the only hope for the Macedonian was close action. The guns of the enemy were too heavy for him and her crew too well practiced in their service to admit of long-range work. With this belief in mind, the Macedonian's captain kept constantly closing in, with the American keeping well off. The sea and wind were in the Macedonian's favor, and Decatur, fearing that the latter might get too close aboard of him, shot out of the smoke ahead at the time when the Macedonian was distant, not more than a pistol shot. Every sail on the British ship was completely gone save the foresail, and Decatur, with the view of destroying this canvas, ordered sections of chain and bags of bolts fired through it. This was done by some of the forward guns of the United States, with the result that the foresail was completely blown to pieces. Having the Macedonian thus crippled, Decatur left up into the wind and shot under the stern of his adversary. He ranked the Macedonian just once, and being now in a position to do the greatest destruction, the Macedonian's flag was hauled down. When Lieutenant Allen of the United States boarded the Macedonian, he found the decks of that vessel fairly running with blood, and on the gun deck there was to be heard a constant drip drip of the blood from the slain overhead. At least 20 bodies had been thrown overboard by the British sailors early in the fight to give more room about decks, and of this number there is a certainty that some were only pushed through the ports to put them out of their misery. In the cockpit, the 2 British surgeons were still working with a zeal that knew no rest. The frightfully mangled limbs were amputated in a quick, merciless fashion. There was a slash of the knife, a sawing of the bone, a turning back of the flap, and then the application of hot pitch or tar to sear all. No wonder Lieutenant Allen called the Macedonian a slaughter pen. Out of 300 men, the British ship had lost 112. The mizzenmast and main topmast had been carried away, and over 100 solid shot had pierced the hull. It took Decatur's men 2 days to rig the Macedonian up as a bark. Under this rig, Lieutenant Allen carried the vessel into port, both ships going to New London. When Captain Carden boarded the United States, he was shown every deference and respect by the gallant Decatur. Both men had met each other prior to the war and had learned to respect one another mutually. It was consequently with no little feeling that Decatur advanced, his both hands outstretched to meet Carden. In stature, both men were much alike, powerfully built yet wiry and active. The British captain, the tears almost rolling down his face from the sad sight of his men lying torn and mangled aboard the Macedonian, advanced towards Decatur and mutely held out his sword. The warm-hearted Decatur was just the man to do at such a time a noble act. Captain Carden, he said, I could never forgive myself if I took the sword from the hands of a man who has used it with the bravery and courage you had displayed. I decline to take it. There are a number of descendants of Captain John Carden in the British Navy today. The name is one that has long been associated with the British colors, and to the writer's own knowledge, every man of them bears in mind the magnanimity once shown a member of the family by an American naval officer. Captain John Carden remained in New London, Connecticut under parole until exchanged. Up to his death, he cherished the warmest affection for Decatur. The two men, in fact, were much alike in spirit. Decatur always allowed an argument that his battery was the heaviest, and though he contended that the act of the British captain in seeking close action was more courageous than prudent, he himself admitted that he saw no other course for a man of honor and high mind to follow if he proposed fighting. Captain John Carden died at about 70 years of age. Despite his loss of the Macedonian, the British Admiralty showed him marked consideration, it being deemed that the fight he made atoned for the loss of the frigate. During the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, a descendant of Captain John Carden, and the only one to ever become an American citizen, served throughout the war as an officer in the Union Army. This story came from the great state of Massachusetts, being reported in the Boston Daily Globe of January 16, 1893. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.